In the decades following the end of the Second World War, governments across the globe carefully constructed narratives of triumph, liberation, and inevitable victory. Textbooks, monuments, and official histories presented a world that was divided neatly between good and evil, between the victors and the vanquished. Yet in the locked archives of Berlin, Washington, Moscow, London, and Tokyo, another war story lurks, one not of clear-cut battles, but of concealed betrayals, shadow alliances, and buried evidence. The truth lies in files stamped Geheime Reichssache, in transcripts sealed with the insignia of the NKVD, in CIA memoranda that were never meant to see daylight. These documents speak of missing trains loaded with treasure, of whispered negotiations in smoke-filled bunkers, of scientists disappearing into the night, and of the macabre calculus of war where entire villages were sacrificed for experiments. They reveal a world where morality was compromised, where the Vatican safeguarded secrets under the veil of holiness, where Stalin carved paths through Berlin, not for victory, but for leverage, where American generals shook hands with war criminals in exchange for forbidden science. These are not tales of conspiracy, but fragments of history deliberately left in shadows, stories erased from official ledgers, silenced in courtroom proceedings, and dismissed as rumor when survivors dared to speak. As we reopen these long-sealed dossiers, one question echoes louder than all others. What price was paid in human lives and in buried truth so that the victors of 1945 could shape the world of today? Chapter 1. Operation Iron Wolf Disappearance Files. The closing months of 1944 were defined not by order, but by panic. The German Reich, once so confident in its lightning campaigns, was collapsing under the relentless push of Soviet armies in the east and the combined pressure of American and British forces in the west. Yet beneath the ruins and the chaos, a network of high-ranking SS officers and disillusioned Abwehr operatives was piecing together a desperate contingency. It was codenamed Operation Iron Wolf. Its purpose was not to defend Berlin or to fortify collapsing fronts, but to smuggle out what remained of Germany's most dangerous secrets: scientific data, experimental designs, and research that could alter the balance of power long after the Reich itself had fallen. The operation's existence emerges only in fragments, half-burned documents recovered from the Reichssicherheitshauptamt, intercepted radio traffic deciphered too late by British codebreakers, and Soviet field reports marked "Destroy after reading." One surviving memorandum, dated November 12, 1944, references strategic shipments to be routed through Constanza under naval escort, a Romanian port that was, at the time, one of the last functioning channels for German withdrawal in the Black Sea. Allied intelligence noted unusual convoys of trucks leaving Vienna in the dead of night, their manifests falsified, their destinations left blank. By the time they reached the Black Sea coast, the cargo had been transferred into sealed containers, guarded by Waffen-SS units under orders of extreme secrecy. Soviet archives from 1945 contain brief but chilling entries, reports of German vessels vanishing en route between Constanza and Sevastopol. Patrols were sent, wreckage occasionally surfaced, but no survivors were ever recovered. Years later, during the 1960s, Soviet naval divers conducting routine training dives near Sevastopol stumbled upon corroded crates stamped with the Reichsadler, the eagle of Nazi Germany. Inside, according to one KGB officer's suppressed account, were fragments of technical schematics relating to propulsion systems and what appeared to be components of experimental warheads. Orders from Moscow were swift and unambiguous. Recover nothing, document nothing, destroy everything. The incident was quietly classified under File 77K, locked away until its accidental rediscovery in the early 1990s. What became of the missing convoys remains an unsolved riddle. Some theories suggest that Allied submarines intercepted and sank the transports, their secrets lost to the sea. Others believe that elements within Soviet intelligence deliberately concealed the recovered material, incorporating German designs into their own weapons programs. The absence of SS officers who should have stood trial at Nuremberg adds fuel to this theory. At least 6 names on Allied wanted lists simply vanish after late 1944. No bodies were recovered, no trials were held, and yet financial transactions linked to their families continued well into the 1950s, traced through Swiss accounts and South American intermediaries. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, conducted in the immediate aftermath of the war, noted inconsistencies in German research facilities. Laboratories believed to have been destroyed were in fact abandoned with precision, equipment neatly dismantled, documents meticulously cleared. American officers noted the absence of expected chaos, as if entire programs had been deliberately extracted before Allied troops ever arrived. This careful evacuation aligns with the objectives outlined in surviving Iron Wolf references, not to preserve the Reich, but to ensure that its most valuable assets would never fall fully into enemy hands. The shadow of Operation Iron Wolf stretches far beyond 1945. In 1947, as the Cold War hardened, a classified CIA memorandum expressed frustration over the Soviets' sudden advancements in rocketry and propulsion, noting uncanny similarities to projects once under the supervision of German scientists. Meanwhile, Soviet complaints surfaced that American laboratories too were advancing suspiciously fast in areas previously dominated by German military engineers. Both sides accused the other of harboring Nazi secrets, yet neither acknowledged the possibility that both had fed from the same hidden source. Eyewitness testimony, scarce but haunting, adds another layer. In 1951, a former Abwehr officer interrogated in British custody described the loading of sealed coffins of steel onto ships at Constanza. He recalled guards who carried orders to shoot even fellow Germans who approached without authorization. He claimed the containers were destined not for Berlin's defense, but for the future war. When pressed to elaborate, he fell silent, refusing to speak further until his sudden death in detention. His file, marked classified indefinitely, was not released until 1989. The disappearance of the convoys, the missing officers, the destroyed Soviet crates, taken together, they suggest a larger truth. The victors of the Second World War may have built their empires not solely upon victory, but upon stolen fragments of a defeated enemy's final gamble. Operation Iron Wolf remains an unfinished story, a half-buried file in the annals of history. Its existence points not only to the desperation of a dying Reich, but to the willingness of post-war powers to conceal, absorb, and weaponize the very secrets they once claimed to have eradicated. The silence surrounding the operation, maintained for decades by both East and West, testifies to a forbidden truth. The world we inhabit today may have been shaped as much by what was hidden beneath the Black Sea as by the battles fought on land. If the transports were indeed lost forever, swallowed by the sea, then they remain a time capsule of a nightmare war. But if even fragments were recovered, by Soviet divers, by American intelligence, or by shadow networks that slipped through the cracks of defeat, then the legacy of Iron Wolf endures, not as rumor, but as a hidden cornerstone of the Cold War's darkest machinery. History, as written in public, insists on victory and liberation, yet the silent gaps, the missing officers, and the drowned convoys remind us that the real ledger of war remains incomplete, its most dangerous entries erased by those who had the most to gain from silence. Chapter 2: The Vatican's Hidden SS Gold Routes. Amid the chaos of collapsing front lines in 1943, when Rome itself trembled under the weight of German occupation, a trail of shadowy financial operations unfolded beneath the sanctuaries of faith. Hidden deep in German field communications, marked with the stamp Geheime Reichssache, Rome 1943, lay the outlines of a clandestine project that would come to be known among SS operatives as Operation Silberkreuz. Its objective was not military, but financial. The Reich, aware that defeat was looming, began transferring vast reserves of plundered wealth, gold stripped from occupied banks, art seized from Jewish families, and currencies confiscated from across Eastern Europe, into channels that could survive the collapse of Nazi Germany itself. The chosen conduit was the Vatican, whose religious immunity and sovereign secrecy made it a perfect cover for laundering blood gold into safety. The central figure in this operation was SS Obersturmbannführer Friedrich Schwendt, a man known within the Reich for his expertise in counterfeiting and financial deception. Schwendt coordinated directly with sympathetic clergy, exploiting the Vatican's extraterritorial privileges to shield convoys of treasure disguised as ecclesiastical shipments. Records show armored trains rolling into Rome under cover of night, escorted by detachments of the elite Hermann Göring division. Each carried sealed crates, their contents officially declared as archival materials or church property, but eyewitnesses later described their unnatural weight and the metallic clatter of bars within. A British Special Operations Executive report, intercepted near Milan in early 1944, detailed suspicions of treasure trains, but offered no means to interdict them without violating Vatican neutrality. What makes the operation chilling is the complicity suggested by missing ledgers. Vatican banking records between 1944 and 1946 contain gaps. Pages meticulously excised, transactions deliberately erased. American investigators with the Office of Strategic Services noted the absence of documentation for large deposits, rumored to have passed through the Istituto per le Opere di Religione, the Vatican's own bank. Fragments that survived reveal cryptic notations linking shipments from Austria and Croatia to accounts that were later funneled into Switzerland. The Swiss National Bank, already infamous for its wartime role in accepting looted gold, became a hub for these assets, which were then transferred through Argentine intermediaries. By 1945, as the Allies liberated Rome, traces of Operation Silberkreuz evaporated. Many of the SS officers associated with the program escaped capture, aided by the very channels the operation had financed. These escape networks became known as the rat lines, clandestine routes shepherding war criminals from Europe to safe havens in South America. Argentina under Juan Perón became the prime destination, but these journeys were not funded out of thin air. They were sustained by the hidden wealth smuggled through the Vatican's shadow corridors. The irony was profound. Men responsible for atrocities in Eastern Europe and the Balkans found freedom not through loyalty to their Reich, but through gold laundered under the protection of the Church. In 1977, during declassification of CIA files, investigators stumbled upon a memorandum describing continued Vatican reluctance to open financial records pertaining to 1944-1946. Attached was testimony from a former US Army investigator who alleged that crates of Nazi gold had been stored in Vatican warehouses under false labels until their transfer to private institutions. Another file referred cryptically to Project Red Cross, suggesting that humanitarian aid shipments may have been used as fronts for moving wealth. None of these leads were ever pursued publicly, a silence born not of lack of evidence, but of political necessity. The Cold War demanded stability in Europe, and dragging the Vatican into scandal threatened that balance. Eyewitness accounts, though scarce, lend further weight. In 1944, an Italian railway worker recalled watching armed SS guards unload heavy crates into Vatican-owned vehicles at Rome's Termini station. He described one officer, muttering in German about the future of our brothers. Overseas, his testimony was collected by Allied investigators, but was later deemed sensitive, buried in archives until its release decades later. Similarly, in post-war Argentina, survivors of the rat lines reported that German fugitives arrived not destitute but financed, carrying access to accounts prepared years in advance. The unanswered question is not whether Operation Silberkreuz existed, it did, but how much of Europe's stolen wealth disappeared into its channels. Estimates vary, but some historians argue that as much as 2/3 of Reich-looted gold never resurfaced in official Allied tallies. Where did it go? The missing Vatican ledgers suggest an answer. It was transformed, laundered into legitimacy, and reinvested into the global financial system through intermediaries shielded by the neutrality of the Church. The silence of both Church and Allies was no accident. For the Vatican, acknowledging involvement meant shattering the image of neutrality and sanctity. For the Allies, exposing the truth risked alienating one of the few moral anchors in post-war Europe, especially as the Cold War deepened and the need for unity against the Soviet Union grew urgent. And so, the blood gold of millions, wealth stolen from extermination camps, from ransacked banks, from entire nations, vanished into a shadow economy, its trail erased by sacred immunity and geopolitical convenience. The scandal occasionally resurfaced, in lawsuits filed by Holocaust survivors seeking restitution, in fleeting headlines about Swiss banking complicity, in whispered debates among historians. But the Vatican's true role remains locked away in archives that may never be fully opened. The files that have emerged paint a haunting picture. Armored trains rolling into the Eternal City, priests turning a blind eye to the cargo, SS officers smiling in the knowledge that their future was being purchased under the cover of holy silence. If the full truth of Operation Silberkreuz were ever laid bare, it would force a reckoning not only with the crimes of the Reich, but with the institutions that enabled their escape. It would reveal that the line between sanctity and complicity, between faith and opportunism, was far thinner than history's official pages suggest. For now, the story remains buried in half-burned files, redacted CIA memoranda, and the testimony of a few witnesses who dared to speak. Yet the shadows it casts are long, reminding us that victory in 1945 was never as clean as we were taught, and that some of the war's darkest treasures were not destroyed, but hidden, sanctified, and allowed to shape the secret balance of the world that followed. Chapter 3: Stalin's Secret Pact for Berlin Division. In the frozen winter of February 1945, with Berlin already within reach of the Red Army, a series of encrypted transmissions began to cross enemy lines. At first glance, they were routine chatter, fragments of Enigma-encoded traffic, directives between German field commanders. Yet within the classified GRU intelligence files, later uncovered in Moscow's dusty archives, one codename surfaced again and again: Directive Zarya 12. These files suggest something that official histories refuse to acknowledge: that Stalin himself authorized clandestine negotiations with select Nazi officials, not for surrender, but for trade. The currency was not territory or prisoners of war, but science. German biological and chemical warfare research, cultivated in hidden facilities across Silesia, was to be exchanged for Soviet restraint in Berlin's final destruction. Surviving fragments of Soviet field reports detail inexplicable pauses in the Red Army's otherwise ruthless advance. In northern Berlin, armored columns were ordered to halt for 72 hours without explanation, despite minimal resistance. At the same time, intercepted Gestapo transmissions boasted of secured passage for essential cargo under the protection of elite SS escorts. This so-called cargo was not gold or stolen art, but personnel, scientists tied to experimental programs whose work promised strategic advantage. US Army G2 files from the same period reveal deep frustration, noting that Soviet units inexplicably bypassed entire sectors of industrial infrastructure, leaving them curiously intact amid the rubble. What those facilities contained becomes clearer in testimony from Soviet soldiers decades later. In the late 1980s, a former Red Army captain recounted entering a deserted laboratory in Silesia, walls lined with shattered glass tanks, strange preserved specimens still floating inside. Documents had been hastily removed, but the captain recalled encountering blackened burn marks along the filing cabinets, as though files had been deliberately torched to prevent Allied inspection. He was ordered never to speak of it, and his unit was reassigned the next morning. The notion of secret negotiations is further supported by anomalies in the Allied Control Council's division of Berlin. Certain districts, most notably areas near the Charité medical complex and several research facilities, remained remarkably undamaged compared to surrounding neighborhoods. Photographic evidence shows streets reduced to ash mere blocks away from structures that survived almost untouched. Western analysts speculated this was coincidence, but the consistency of such patterns points to targeted preservation, as if invisible boundaries had been respected during the city's destruction. Gestapo files that survived the war provide another clue. File No. 128F references an agreement with the East for the safekeeping of our finest minds. Though the file breaks off mid-sentence, its existence alone is incriminating. Combined with Soviet archive references to Zarya 12, a chilling picture forms. While Berliners starved and civilians were slaughtered in the streets, arrangements were being made at the highest levels to safeguard select Nazi scientists for Soviet use. Western powers suspected as much. Decrypted Enigma traffic reviewed at Bletchley Park revealed odd communications from late March 1945, referencing the special transfer to the East. The messages were fragmented, often overwritten with false coordinates, but the British analysts who compiled them noted parallels with their own post-war operations, such as America's Operation Paperclip. The implication was unavoidable. While Allies prepared to absorb German expertise, Stalin had already made his own deal. The aftermath of these exchanges became visible in the years that followed. By 1947, Soviet laboratories were producing startling advancements in biological and chemical warfare. developments that far outpaced expectations given the USSR's wartime devastation. Western intelligence noted eerie similarities to German programs rumored to have operated in Silesia. The KGB's refusal to release records on certain scientists who should have been tried at Nuremberg further fuels suspicion. Names appear briefly in German rosters, vanish in 1945, and reappear years later in obscure Soviet technical journals. Eyewitnesses in Berlin add to the mystery. In April 1945, a local nurse recalled watching a convoy of black trucks pass through the ruins near Alexanderplatz, guarded not by Wehrmacht, but by Soviet soldiers. She claimed the convoy carried men in white coats, heads bowed, surrounded by crates covered with tarps. When she later mentioned the event to Allied officers, she was dismissed as hysterical. Her testimony, rediscovered in Allied interrogation transcripts decades later, fits seamlessly with the narrative of Directive Zarya 1200. The silence surrounding this pact is deliberate. For the Soviet Union, admitting to cooperation with Nazi officials would have undermined the very foundation of their victory narrative. For the Western Allies, exposing the deal would have revealed their own hypocrisy, as American and British intelligence were themselves absorbing Nazi expertise under classified programs. Better then for all sides to bury the evidence, to let the myth of total victory stand unchallenged. The truth, pieced together from scraps of testimony and fragments of burned files, suggests that Berlin was not merely conquered, but bargained over in secret. Stalin's hunger for power outweighed his hatred of Nazism. For him, the future Cold War demanded superiority in every field, even if it meant shaking hands with the architects of atrocity. In the silent corridors of Soviet archives, one can still find the ghosts of these negotiations. Cryptic references, unexplained pauses in battle reports, and redacted names that hint at a hidden betrayal. For the civilians who perished in Berlin's final inferno, none of this mattered. Their homes were reduced to rubble, their families shattered, their city carved apart. But in the sealed offices of Moscow, their suffering was weighed against the promise of forbidden science. And the choice was made. The Reich would fall, but its secrets would live on, repurposed under a different flag. Directive Zarya 1200 remains one of the darkest shadows of the war's end, a reminder that victory was not built solely on courage and sacrifice, but also on bargains struck in silence at the expense of truth. Chapter 4. Japan's Unit 731. American Absorption. In the ruins of post-war Asia, amid the ashes of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, another story unfolded in silence, one so disturbing that it would be hidden behind the thickest layers of classification. At its center was Unit 731, the Imperial Japanese Army's covert biological warfare division, headquartered in Harbin, Manchuria. Officially, its existence was denied, erased from records as if it had never been. Yet for decades, survivors in China whispered of atrocities. Entire villages wiped out by plague, prisoners subjected to vivisection without anesthesia, men frozen alive to study the effects of hypothermia. Evidence of these crimes surfaced during the Soviet-run Khabarovsk trials in 1949, where Japanese doctors admitted under oath to unspeakable experiments. Washington, however, dismissed the testimony as propaganda, concealing its own role in the absorption of Unit 731's legacy. The truth, revealed through declassified US Army intelligence files, is that General Douglas MacArthur himself authorized secret negotiations with surviving Unit 731 officers. The deal was explicit: immunity from prosecution in exchange for exclusive access to the unit's research. This arrangement was never recorded at the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal. Unlike German doctors who stood trial at Nuremberg, the architects of Japan's biological warfare walked free, their crimes buried under a shroud of Cold War necessity. At Fort Detrick in Maryland, the United States Army's premier biological warfare research facility, scientists began to receive shipments of translated documents from Japan in 1946. These files were catalogued under innocuous-sounding project codes, but contained detailed accounts of pathogen testing, plague deployment, and frostbite endurance trials. A Joint Chiefs of Staff memorandum from 1947 described the material as of the highest intelligence value, noting that the data could not be replicated without contravening the moral and legal standards of Western civilization. The chilling implication was clear. America had acquired knowledge that it could never ethically reproduce, but was eager to exploit nonetheless. The Soviet Union, for its part, broadcasted the Khabarovsk trial proceedings to the world, showcasing testimony from former Unit 731 officers who confessed to infecting wells with cholera, releasing plague-carrying fleas over Chinese villages, and dissecting prisoners alive. Western media dismissed the trial as fabricated, a propaganda spectacle designed to smear Japan and the United States. Yet internal CIA assessments later admitted that many of the details aligned disturbingly well with intelligence already in American possession. The dismissal was not about truth, but about control of the narrative. The survivors of Unit 731's horrors were left without justice. In Harbin, Chinese families searched for missing relatives who had vanished into the compound's gates, never to return. Local testimony described trucks arriving at night, carrying prisoners bound for experiments euphemistically labeled logs by the Japanese staff. The term itself, maruta, reflected the dehumanization at the heart of the program. When the war ended, the compound was hastily abandoned. Its laboratories torched, but enough fragments remained, scattered equipment, scorched medical records, preserved tissue samples, to confirm the scale of atrocities. Soviet investigators seized what they could, while American forces ensured that the most valuable documents were diverted into their own custody. The names of those spared prosecution appear in classified rosters. General Shiro Ishii, the commander of Unit 731, should have stood among the accused at Tokyo. Instead, he was quietly debriefed by US Army officers in 1946 and lived the remainder of his life in relative obscurity in Japan, never facing trial. Several of his subordinates went on to successful careers in post-war Japan, some even becoming prominent figures in medicine and academia. Their silence was purchased, not with money, but with immunity guaranteed by Washington's hidden hand. The implications for the Cold War were immediate. By the 1950s, US biological warfare programs had advanced rapidly, incorporating insights from Unit 731 into their studies of plague, anthrax, and other pathogens. Documents reveal field tests conducted in the Pacific, where harmless but traceable bacteria were released to study dispersal patterns in urban environments. These experiments bore the unmistakable influence of Unit 731's data, allowing American scientists to bypass years of research by leaning on the gruesome legacies of Japanese war crimes. For decades, survivors and historians attempted to expose the truth. In the 1980s, Japanese activists uncovered testimonies from former soldiers who admitted their role in Unit 731. Declassified American files gradually confirmed what had long been suspected, that the US government deliberately obstructed prosecution to secure exclusive access to forbidden science. Yet official acknowledgement never came. Washington continued to deny formal involvement, and Japanese courts dismissed lawsuits filed by survivors seeking recognition and compensation. The story of Unit 731's absorption into American research is not simply about scientific theft. It is about the erasure of justice. By trading immunity for data, the United States ensured that some of the worst crimes of the 20th century would remain unpunished. The silence of the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal on Unit 731 is deafening, a deliberate omission that reveals the priorities of a world already pivoting toward Cold War rivalry. Justice for the victims was sacrificed at the altar of strategic advantage. Even today, traces of this pact linger in classified files and unanswered questions. How much of America's biological warfare capability was built on the backs of Unit 731's victims? To what extent did Soviet archives conceal their own absorption of similar data? And perhaps most disturbingly, how many lives could have been spared if the truth had been acknowledged, if those responsible had been held accountable rather than shielded? Unit 731 remains a ghost that haunts the post-war order. Its laboratories may have been reduced to rubble, its officers long dead, but the knowledge they generated, through suffering, torture, and mass murder, was never destroyed. It was absorbed, sanitized, and reborn under new banners. In the corridors of Fort Detrick and in the sealed vaults of Moscow, fragments of that forbidden science endure, a silent reminder that the victors of war are not always innocent, and that sometimes the greatest crimes are not exposed, but inherited. In the silence of classified vaults, the fragments we have unearthed point to a reality far darker than official histories allow. The Reich's final convoys, vanishing into the Black Sea, whisper of a desperate gamble that may have seeded the very technologies that defined the Cold War. The Vatican's guarded ledgers, with their missing pages and erased entries, cast suspicion on an institution that cloaked stolen gold in sanctity while helping war criminals vanish into new lives abroad. Stalin's secret arrangement, buried under the codename Zarya 12, reveals a betrayal that preserved forbidden knowledge at the expense of millions caught in Berlin's inferno. And across the seas, Unit 731's horrors were not condemned, but absorbed, their victims' suffering transmuted into classified files at Fort Detrick. Taken together, these hidden stories suggest that the Second World War did not truly end in 1945. It simply shifted form, transforming from a conflict of armies into a conflict of secrets, where knowledge became the most valuable weapon and morality the first casualty. The victors, once hailed as liberators, are shown here not only as inheritors of triumph, but as custodians of buried crimes. The question that lingers is not whether these secrets existed. They did. But how much of our present world was built upon them? Every missing crate, every erased ledger, every vanished name is a reminder that history is not a closed book, but a palimpsest, its darkest truths scraped away, rewritten and hidden beneath the surface. And as new archives open, and as survivors' voices continue to rise, we are left to wonder how many more forbidden files remain sealed, waiting to tell us that the war we thought was over still shadows the world we live in today.